A ship sails in the middle of the vast ocean. Inside the main deck, Captain Mortimer sits at a table, poring over his book that contains information about different types of monsters, while taking a shot of tequila. On the lower deck, Simmons offers the crewmates lemon juice from Mr. Blackwood, who's playing the accordion, to Mr. Ashcroft, who's listening to him, to Mr. Redgrave. Then Marlowe comes in, grabs 2 glasses, and immediately chugs one down before Simmons stops him. He annoyingly taps Simmons on the cheek and tells him there's enough to go around, but Simmons urges him to ration it, which he nonchalantly ignores. Marlowe tries to start up a conversation with Redgrave by asking him what he's drawing. He snatches the sketchbook from him to see an unfinished drawing of a lady. Redgrave collects the sketchbook back and informs Marlowe that the book is the only thing they have to document their rescue mission, and he plans to sell it once they get back home. Marlowe then questions how they're all working, and Redgrave is there, barely breaking a sweat, expecting to make more money than all of them. He asks Redgrave to teach him how to draw, which Redgrave declines, but he still persists, saying he can do anything an average man can if he puts his head to it. Ashcroft butts in and tells Redgrave to draw him instead, but Marlowe contends that a drawing of him wouldn't be worth anything. Ashcroft savagely replies, saying that's not what his wife told him the night before they set sail. This gets Marlowe angry, and he starts wrestling Ashcroft to the ground. Redgrave, annoyed with their behavior, leaves the room while Blackwood keeps on playing his accordion as they fight. Redgrave meets Simmons in the kitchen, and they discuss how they've been on this mission for 2 years now. They're gradually running low on supplies, which were supposed to last for about 3 years. Redgrave tries to reassure Simmons that they'll be done by the end of the next winter, forgetting that the captain's an optimist and might want to continue if the mission isn't completed. Redgrave then sneaks off to meet Carmen. Barnabas hurriedly walks into the hall to discuss the plan of action with the captain, because they are currently sailing into very dangerous waters. They are sailing off course, and the ice is getting thicker. Gideon, who joins them, reminds Barnabas that they are sailing on the Innsmouth, a huge ship that his father built with hulls plated with iron, but he still doesn't agree with them. He tries to convince the captain to turn the ship around, because, at this point, they've sailed further than any ship that has safely returned. Even after much persuasion, the captain informs him that he can change their course, but cannot retreat. Once they find the Ibon and her crew, they'll return home as heroes. Barnabas then walks out, and Gideon chases after him, questioning why he doesn't believe the mission can be a success. He warns Gideon of the dangers beyond this point in the Arctic, and that if he cherishes his privileged lifestyle, he should convince the captain to turn the ship around. Just then, the ship strikes a huge ice sheet that brings it to a halt. The captain instructs Gideon to order the crew members to dig the ice and free the ship. Meanwhile, Redgrave is in his cabin, chatting with Carmen. Just then, Marlowe barges in on them and discovers that Carmen is surprisingly a woman, a stowaway that Redgrave has been hiding all this time. Redgrave begs him not to tell the captain, but Marlowe doesn't agree and takes Carmen to the captain, who doesn't punish her. Instead, he instructs her that to stay on the ship, she has to do what the men do to survive in the Arctic. As Redgrave goes down to inspect the cargo hold, he finds Ashcroft, wounded and bloody on the floor. In greatest fear, he sees a monster that looks like the villains from a 2000s Power Rangers cartoon rise from inside a barrel, assassinate Ashcroft, and leave him severely injured, causing him to scream and attract everyone's attention. The captain, along with Barnabas, hurries down to see what has happened. They find Redgrave on the ground with a talon in his leg. Simmons, who is in the kitchen, hears a noise from behind and assumes it's Marlowe, probably trying to steal food. But then he hears a noise coming from the back. He picks up a knife to use as a weapon. He's terrified when he sees the monster come out of hiding. They carry Redgrave to the infirmary, and Barnabas removes the talon from his leg and ties a piece of cloth around his leg to prevent him from bleeding out. The captain asks Redgrave what he saw, and he describes an eerie half-man, half-amphibian monster, with gills and scales all over it. Gideon pulls Carmen into a room and locks her in there. Redgrave also sketches the creature, and the captain compares it to the one in his book. Realizing it's the same creature, the captain orders Marlowe to arm every man on the ship with shotguns. In a panic, Barnabas hurries to the kitchen to get food to take with him off the ship. As he enters, he sees Simmons on the floor being eaten by the monsters, which makes him run out, horrified. The captain meets Marlowe on the deck and tells him they need to get off the ship onto the ice. He collects his rifle and heads to butcher the monsters. Carmen, who was locked up, keeps banging on the door of the room until she breaks it open and gets out. Outside the ship, Gideon runs up front, but the captain catches him and asks about the stowaway. However, Gideon reveals he left her on the ship because he wanted her to stay put. He then tries to run again, but the captain pushes him to the ground, telling him they have to stick together if they are going to survive. Barnabas comes along with Marlowe to inform the captain that everyone on the ship is probably deceased by now. Carmen is still trying to find her way off the ship when she stumbles upon the monsters chewing down on one of the crew members. She hurriedly picks up a nearby shotgun and enters the infirmary, where she finds Redgrave, who was abandoned by the captain and others. She loads the shotgun and helps Redgrave stand as they also try to find their way off the ship. Meanwhile, the captain, along with Gideon, Barnabas, and Marlowe, walks for miles in search of shelter from the ice and cold wind. Marlowe asks the captain what they're going to do, but the captain insists that they keep on moving. Out of anger and frustration, Barnabas snaps at him and yells that they need to find shelter from the ice instead of trying to find Strainer, who was lost on his own expedition in the Arctic. The captain says he can't just abandon Strainer because they are like brothers, and he is determined to rescue him. As they think of what to do, Gideon looks back and sees Redgrave and Carmen coming from behind them. The captain rushes to Redgrave, happy that he is alive, and asks if there is any other survivor, but unfortunately, there isn't. Carmen is tired from carrying Redgrave, so the captain tells Barnabas and Marlowe to help him up. But Marlowe is reluctant. As they move through the Arctic wasteland, Barnabas sights a cave in the mountain about half a mile away and tells the captain. As they get close to the mountain, they know that anything can be in the cave, but Barnabas has already made up his mind to go as long as it's free from wind and snow. As they enter the cave, the captain tells them to stay together as Barnabas lights up a lantern so they can see. As they settle down, Barnabas sees a frozen corpse on the floor, one of Strainer's men. He pries a gun from the corpse's hand, and Marlowe gives everyone a gun to be on guard. Carmen and the captain decide to venture deeper into the dark, shadowy cave to find out if it's safe for everyone, unaware of the horror that awaits them. On their way, they come across another frozen corpse, only to realize that it belongs to a relative of Carmen. She screams out loud upon seeing this, which makes the other crew members run over to see what happened. The crew finds a safe campsite in the cave, while the captain stays back with Carmen and investigates a strange sound that he's just heard. They find a place in the cave to settle, and then comes the worry of how long they're going to be there and how the supplies with them aren't going to be enough at all. Barnabas sits Redgrave down to inspect his leg, only to discover that he has lost all sense of feeling in the leg. This means he wouldn't be able to walk on it. He keeps that to himself and goes aside, but Gideon confronts him and tells him to chop it off. However, Barnabas disagrees. They argue that Redgrave would be a burden to them, and that every day until he passes away, he's going to eat part of the supplies. Barnabas tries to convince him that they need to help each other in this critical time, but Gideon believes it's every man for himself. Marlowe picks up a bag and leaves Redgrave alone, saying he needs to poop and wouldn't want to do it in his presence. He goes on alone and starts eating through the supplies he has with him, while the captain explores the cave in hopes of finding his long-lost friend Strainer. He comes across an area filled with lit candles and an old gramophone that is still on. In the middle of it all sits his lost friend, Strainer. He says the monsters, called ichthyoids, like the music playing from the gramophone, which he salvaged from the wreckage of his ship. He tells the captain that everyone is deceased except him, but he's not alone. With this, he lets out a sinister laugh. The captain is happy to have found his friend, but something seems different about him. Strainer asks about the book that contained information about the monsters that he left. The captain is confused because he thought Strainer was supposed to be on an expedition to the North Pole, but instead, he went on a wild goose chase. He tells the captain about how the ichthyoids are strong and have adapted to the harsh conditions of the Arctic, and that humans are their servants. He plans to take them back to civilization, to control and take over mankind. The captain gets mad at him and tells him of the effort it took to find him, only for him to be plotting such evil. He wouldn't allow Strainer to go on with such a plan, and runs away from there. As Marlowe sits in the dark, eating a loaf of bread from the supplies, he starts to hear a sound and sees something in the shadows coming toward him. He picks up an apple and throws it at the figure, but suddenly, the monster is behind him. He yells and the rest of the crew run towards the noise. But before they get there, Marlowe is already surrounded by the ichthyoids. They start shooting, but can't end them all. As Gideon tries to pull Marlowe from the grip of an ichthyoid, he fails, and it rips Marlowe's hand from his body. They attempt to save Marlowe, but to no avail. He is dragged away by the ichthyoids into the shadows. Then Carmen appears and shoots her gun, scaring off the monsters. But unfortunately, it is too late to save Marlowe. The captain goes outside with Barnabas right behind him. He tells Barnabas that they have to destroy the ship so Strainer won't be able to carry out his evil plan. Barnabas, surprised to hear that Strainer is alive, is curious and asks the captain what they're really going to do. Even if they destroy the ship, another rescue team is going to come for them, but the captain hopes they won't reach this far. If they do, Strainer would take over the ship and carry the ichthyoids to civilization to take over humanity. Barnabas understands the huge sacrifice they're about to make and asks how they plan to destroy the ship. The explosives on the ship will be enough to destroy it, the captain says. The problem is how they are going to tell the rest of the crew, but the captain chooses not to, and allows them to hold on to hope a while longer. Back in the cave, Barnabas tells Gideon to follow him back to the ship to get supplies, but Gideon is reluctant and asks why the captain or Carmen can't go with him. Barnabas says Carmen would fight off the monsters if they came back to protect Redgrave, who can't walk. He knows damn well that Gideon doesn't care about Redgrave. The captain tells Gideon their current supplies won't last through the week. They don't even know how long they will be there. He wishes them good luck, and Barnabas prays they'll still be there when they get back, because it's only a matter of time before the monsters come back to feed. Redgrave asks the captain why they all can't go back to the ship. The captain tells him he wouldn't make it, but Redgrave says no one should have to wait in the cave because of him. The captain refuses to leave Redgrave behind and tells him it's only a matter of time before the ice outside crushes the ship. Redgrave argues they can't just sit around and expect the monsters to pick them off one by one. Carmen asks why they need to wait when they can fight instead. Even though there might be over hundreds of the monsters, it just means she has more to butcher. She gets mad and rebukes the captain that he's underestimated her. From now on, she's not going to hide. She will do things her way. On their way back to the ship, Gideon tries to convince Barnabas that they can both man the ship and go back. They can send others to come rescue the rest. But Barnabas refuses, saying they can't just leave them in the cave like that. Even though following the captain's orders hasn't done them any good so far, he's still the captain. Back in the cave, the captain goes to find Strainer again to end his life, but he isn't sitting where he was before. All of a sudden, he hears Strainer's voice from the shadows asking if he's finally ready to join him in serving the monsters. But the captain refuses and tells him he already sent his men to scuttle the ship. There's no way for Strainer to return. Strainer doesn't believe him and keeps trying to convince the captain to join him. After much persuasion to no avail, Strainer attacks the captain, jumping on him from the roof of the cave. He wrestles him to the ground and knocks the gun out of his hands. Strainer hits the captain with a stone, and as the captain tries to fight him off, Strainer bites 2 fingers off his hand. Despite having lost 2 fingers, the captain still tries to tell Strainer it's not too late to send the monsters back to sleep in the ice. But it's too late for Strainer. His mind is already too dark, as he feels he's now more human than any of them. The captain pushes him off and hurries to load his gun. But as he shoots, he misses, and a monster emerges with Strainer. Strainer tells the captain not to try to assassinate him because he has an army of monsters by his side. When he discovered them, they walked on all 4s, but as time went on, they started to adapt and walk like men, yet became stronger and more agile. The captain throws a bottle at him and shoots, knocking Strainer down. As he stands over Strainer, he hesitates to pull the trigger. Strainer knows the captain can't take the life of an old friend, but the captain knocks him out with the base of the gun. As they get back to the ship, Barnabas tells Gideon to go to the kitchen to get supplies, while he needs to find something else. Gideon is scared and reluctantly goes on his own. As he enters the kitchen, he's terrified when he sees Simmons' lifeless body on the floor, his guts spilling out. He starts to pack the supplies when he hears a noise from behind. He picks up a knife to check what it is, but as he steps out of the kitchen, he runs into Barnabas, and they both get scared. As he looks at the crate Barnabas is carrying, he sees explosives and asks what they're for. Barnabas tells him the captain has ordered him to blow up the ship. However, Gideon argues that he owns the ship, and it is their only way out of the Arctic wasteland, their only way back home. Barnabas reminds him of how he tried to warn both him and the captain, but they chose to have things their way, and now they all have to pay the price for it. He says he has accepted his fate and is ready to do what he can. Before he finishes talking, Gideon slashes his throat with a knife and tells him that he will not be left to meet his demise out there. Gideon then leaves with the crate. In the cave, Redgrave sits on the floor, groaning in pain. He picks up the captain's book and opens it to see pictures of the monster in it. He starts to spaz out, but quickly picks up his pencil and hurriedly draws something in the book. Carmen is fixing up her rifle when the captain walks in, with blood on his hands and 2 fingers missing. She asks what happened, and he goes to show her. Gideon, on the other hand, walks back from the ship alone, but goes to hide the supplies in the snow. The captain and Carmen reach where Strainer is tied down. The captain throws him a punch when the sly man asks about his hand. Strainer is surprised to see a woman and asks how she got there. The captain tells him that she was a stowaway on the ship. Then Strainer goes on to say he hasn't seen a woman in years, and that if his hands weren't tied, he would have been inside her in a flash. This causes the captain to punch him in the face. Carmen asks about her relative, Benito, and Strainer laughs, saying he was a weakling for blowing his head off. His demise was a waste. He goes on to say he used all the crew members as sacrificial lambs to pave the way for his discovery. He says human life has no value, that the monsters can live for eons. Carmen and the captain are both disappointed that this is what's left of the great captain of the North Pole. However, that whole thing was a lie. He used it as a means to carry a supply of flesh and blood for the monsters. As Gideon gets back, he tells the captain that they were attacked on the ship and Barnabas was assassinated by the monsters. He also lies to the captain, saying they blew up the ship with dynamite and he couldn't bring back supplies. But when the captain sees blood on his hand, he suspects something is wrong. Redgrave is still shaking on the floor when Carmen hears someone faintly call her name. She looks up and sees Benito. Eerily, he goes deep inside the cave, and she follows him. The captain goes out and sees where Gideon stashed the supplies from the ship. Gideon finds Strainer tied up in the cave. Strainer immediately recognizes him and starts to deceive him. He tells Gideon that the captain captured him and tied him down because he was jealous of his achievement and wants all the glory to himself. Gideon tells Strainer that the captain wanted to blow up the ship, but he stopped it. He says he just wants to get back home to England. Strainer tells him that he can captain the Innsmouth back to England. Gideon asks how he escaped the monsters all this time, and Strainer says they're like dogs that can be trained properly. He tells Gideon that his crew had small minds and lost their sanity in the mountain. He instructs him to untie the ropes, and they would escape together. Carmen is still following the sound of her name when she comes upon a huge pillar with writings on it. Gideon shows Strainer where Redgrave is sitting. Redgrave recognizes him from the dreams he's been having. Strainer says they're his own dreams, then shoots Redgrave, blowing his brains out. He tells Gideon that if he wants to survive, he should follow without asking any questions. They go on to use the gramophone to play music that attracts the monsters. Carmen rushes in and sees Redgrave deceased on the ground. As the captain sees them, he rushes to where he tied Strainer and sees that he's been untied. Just then Redgrave starts to rise from lifelessness. But before he can fully rise, the captain shoots him again, knowing full well that it's no longer Redgrave. Strainer and Gideon walk to the pillar known as the obelisk, the great stone that commands the creatures. He puts the book he took from Redgrave into a space in the stone, and the cave starts shaking. Then he says a quote. Carmen and the captain load their guns, ready to take down the monsters. The captain goes to find Strainer, but encounters a bunch of monsters on his way. Knowing he can't end them all, he turns back, while Carmen butchers as many monsters as she can find. As Gideon tries to find his way out of the cave, he meets the monsters on the way. Seeing there's nowhere to go, he calls out for help. Carmen sees him screaming as he tells her to shoot the monsters, but she refuses and watches the monsters assassinate and eat Gideon. As the captain continues searching for Strainer, he sees the gramophone on the way to where the huge pillar stands. He takes the book out and replaces it with a couple of dynamite sticks. As he is setting it up, he gets shot in the knee by Strainer, who tells him it's too late and no one can stop them now. But the captain doesn't give up and hides behind the pillar while Strainer shoots at him. Once Strainer runs out of bullets, the captain points his gun and tells him it's over. Strainer runs and attacks the captain, knocking him to the ground and punching him. The captain overpowers him, turns him over, and punches him multiple times before stabbing him with his knife. He then sticks 3 dynamites in the stab wounds. Before he can ignite the dynamite, Strainer reaches for his gun and shoots him in the chest. As he stands up to shoot him one more time, no bullet comes out, so he just walks away, leaving the captain on the ground to bleed to his demise. Strainer walks out to tell the monsters that it's time for them to leave the Arctic and take over the world. But before he can finish his speech, Carmen shoots him, igniting the dynamites. At the same time, the captain reaches for a lighter and ignites the dynamite in the pillar, quickly rushing outside. Just as Carmen gets out, the dynamites explode, blowing Strainer to bits and collapsing the pillar. She then sees the captain in front of the cave, nearing his demise. As she walks up to him and places a pendant in his hand, he breathes his last. Carmen walks out of the cave into the Arctic as the only survivor of the rescue mission.